It is such an honour to be here tonight with you. I have been to Oxford before. It was about 3 years ago, and we were invited along, not to the Oxford Union, but to talk about forced marriage and dishonour-based abuse. And on that evening, I remember there was a young woman in the audience, and she came up to me afterwards and said, "I'm about to be forced into a marriage from a man in Cambridge. He's at Cambridge University. I'm at Oxford, and I have absolutely no say in what's going to happen, and I'm terrified." So when we think about the issues I'm going to talk to you about this evening, please don't think they're somebody else's problem. Please don't think that you aren't part of the solution. I hope by the end of today, you will know the difference between arranged or forced marriage, understand FGM, understand dishonour, and how each and every one of you can make a difference to save lives. Because we all have it in us. And what's the girl from Bethnal Green doing at Oxford? Someone who flunked their A-levels because they were too busy setting up a united assembly. I think a lot of that comes from my father, Chandrasekhar Prem. He was a huge inspiration. He was so ahead of his time in terms of women's rights, equal right for all. And when I often meet people from Indian descent, they always say to me, "Well, what's your real name? It can't be Prem. Your name really isn't Anita Prem, is it?" I said, "Well, it is. I was born in Bethnal Green Hospital, and on my birth certificate it says Anita Prem." And they said, "It isn't. What was your real name?" "And this is my real name, Anita Prem." My father his original surname was Sharma. And that detects, to most people that know about the Hindu caste system, that I was born as a Hindu Brahmin. But my father felt that excluded people from his work as a writer and all the important things he did in setting up a college in India and being as inclusive as he could be. So by changing our surname to Love, because that's what Prem means, it meant it was universal. It meant his work was open to everybody that felt it would exclude them. So I'm in Bethnal Green, we live in a council flat, and I share a bed with my sister Vanita. And we had a really happy childhood. There was no questions of forced marriages or any type of abuse in our house. I grew up wanting so many things in life, not material things, but things that would make life better. And I think my father was horrified when I failed my A-levels. And I wasn't able to resit because my father was taken very ill and we had a mortgage to pay. So that fell on me, but I'm not upset about that. I would have loved to have thought I could have got the grades and come to Oxford. Reality is I probably couldn't have. But you all have a huge power within you. Being students at the Oxford Union, at Oxford, means that you have the power to make a difference. You are the generation that are going to make things happen. You are the generation to end forced marriage, female genital mutilation, and all the other horrific offences that are happening, not only against girls and women, but boys too. So I'm in Bethnal Green and we moved to Chigwell, and suddenly we've got a house with a garden and we've got trees. And I think it's going to be amazing. And as I start school, from being the head girl in my secondary school just for the first year, I suddenly experience racism. I suddenly discover that I'm brown and people don't like it. And terms like Paki were used upon me most days I went to school. For a year and a half, nobody in school spoke to me. And I found that really difficult because one of the things I do is talk all the time. And to suddenly be in an environment, but just because of the colour of your skin, you're going to be excluded, you're going to be hated, people are going to treat you differently. At 12 years old, that made me more determined to make a difference. That made me more determined to have a wide circle of friends and try and end racism. And now there is still racism out there. We all know it. Most of us experience it. But it's now more covert. We all have it in us to make a difference. So I'm now in an area where I'm hated, and I remember a girl walks past my house and my dad said, "Oh, my daughter Anita wants some friends. Where are you off to?" Like I need to be forced to have friends. And this girl said, "I'm doing karate." So I went along to the local karate club, fell in love with the karate instructor, the sensei, at 12. And I thought the way to get notices is I'm really bad and I'll really get on in his nerves and he'll keep saying, "Well, Anita this, Anita that." I remember one evening his girlfriend came round to the club and she said to me, "You know, the way to get noticed, Anita, isn't to be really bad, but to be really good." And that actually changed things, and that suddenly made me think, okay, I'll be really good at doing this karate. And I ended up having 7 karate clubs in London and having lots of students at the age of 17. And at 17, I was excited. I was a very kind sensei. I was really interested in empowering knowledge, and it was fantastic. And I remember the first competition we had, all the parents were invited, the local mayor came along, the newspaper came, and it was a big event. And my parents came down and it was exciting. And I remember this one particular girl, and I'm going to change her name. Her name is Sarah. Let's call her that. That's not her real name. And while Sarah is there in my club, she wins all the competitions. She wins the fighting competition, she wins the kata competition. And at the end of it, I go up to her parents and say, "You must be so proud of your daughter. She's done amazingly well." And they say, "Well, what about our son, Mohammed? He hasn't won anything." I said, "Well, he's got a medal." He said, "But all your students have got a medal. Why hasn't he won anything more than that?" "Well, he just wasn't good enough." But it's very difficult to say that to a parent. And I said, "Well, he's younger than her, and hopefully he'll get better next time. And I'm sure, and we'll spend extra effort to make sure that he wins something on the next occasion." Now, we were in an area where the 11 plus was happening, and Sarah was at the local grammar school doing incredibly well. I remember she come into class and told me that Mohammed hadn't passed his 11 plus and was crying. And I thought, well, why is she emotional about her brother not passing? She said, "Well, I'm going to be taken out of school because my brother hasn't passed the 11 plus. And I couldn't understand that. I had no concept about what that meant. And I remember going home and speaking to my parents about it. And my dad said, "Well, that's ridiculous. They wouldn't take her out of school. The authorities will deal with this." I remember the parents came into the class and said, "You can't be taking her out of school." And then they said to me they were taking her out of karate because they wanted her brother to do better. He had to beat her. He had to be better than her because in their world, boys were far more important than girls. And she stopped coming. I remember the last night I saw her at the club, she was sitting in the back of her car. They wouldn't even let her out of the car to speak to me. And I spoke to her through the car window and I said, "Look, just let her come in. She can help me with the register. You don't need to have money for her to come into my class. I just would love her to be around." And they wouldn't allow that to happen. A few years later, we had a competition, a reunion, and all the students were talking and we had new shields. And I said, "Whatever happened to all my amazing shields that I had at my club?" I said, "Oh, Sarah had them." I said, "Oh, we must try and get in contact with her to get them back." And one of the students said, "Do you not know she's married?" I said, "Well, she'd only be 17 now. She can't possibly be married. That's very young." "Oh, okay. It's interesting." I said, "Well, she didn't have a choice. She was taken to Pakistan and forced to marry against her will." And I said, "When I get home tonight, I'm going to phone the police and we're going to deal with this. This cannot be allowed to happen in the UK." And my student said to me, "That's not possible." I said, "Well, I'm the karate instructor. I'm wearing a black belt. Of course it's possible." And they said, "It's not possible. You can't bring her back to the UK." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Sarah took her own life." And at that moment, I knew I had to do something about forced marriages. But I had never heard of the concept forced marriage. I didn't know where it had come from. My parents met and fell in love. And I hadn't come from a culture, a community where anybody I'd heard had been forced into marriage. So why would I even expect that it had happened to Sarah? I did call the police and they said they could do nothing about it. It wasn't a criminal offence. The years go by, I have various jobs. I'm still teaching karate. And I end up on the police authority in London. And I remember the commissioner at the time said to me, "What interests you?" And I said, "Well, property," and listed a whole list of things. And I said, "But also the issue of forced marriage, female genital mutilation, and dishonour-based violence." And I use that term, dishonour. We will not use the term honour, because there is no honour in what we're talking about. We're talking about the most horrific crimes. When we're talking about forced marriage, we're talking about young girls and boys that are often taken abroad. Sometimes it happens in the UK, and they're forced to marry against their will. So should we be bothered about that? Well, a forced marriage not only leads to domestic abuse, leads to slavery, leads to serial rape, but it also leads to murder. And Asian girls are 3 times more likely between the age of 16 to 24 to take their own life than any other group in the UK. So I was asked, at the time when I was leaving the police authority, I was talking to various people about how we could prevent forced marriages from happening. There were lots of good charities dealing with rescuing girls once it had happened, but we needed to prevent it. We needed to prevent horrendous crimes from happening. So I set up Freedom Charity with Lord Toby Harris. And the aim of the charity was to make forced marriage a criminal offence. And I was told that was never going to happen. It was too politically sensitive. It would drive the crime underground. Well, nobody openly talks about forced marriages. So why would it drive it underground? So I started to talk to prime ministers, to home secretaries, and introduce them to girls it had happened to, and started to change opinions. And I'm really proud to say that in 2014, forced marriage became a crime in the UK, and it can lead to up to 7 years imprisonment. But what that has meant for me is, as someone that has started a charity, that we can now go into schools openly and talk about forced marriage without people being scared of offending anybody. Why are we scared of offending perpetrators? And I wanted to make a movie about forced marriages, but we didn't have the budget. And I was talking to lots and lots of schools, and they said, "Why don't you write a book?" So I wrote But It's Not Fair. And as a charity, I'm really proud to say we've managed to circulate that to over 55,000 young children as a donation. We've given that free. And for many children, it's the first book they have ever owned. And that's hugely important. To have books at home for children is really important. And the book Going Home has saved lives. Girls that are so-called home educated, who are not educated at all at home, they're just being taken out of school, receive the book at home for a sibling still being at school, and they read about it, and they contact Freedom Charity for our 24/7 helpline or our help app. And that has helped save lives. Going into schools, we've seen over 55,000 children face to face and spoken to them about it. In these times of COVID, we're doing it now remotely. The book was so successful, the Home Office and various other organisations, Department of Education, said, "Why don't you start talking about female genital mutilation? Why can't you bring that up in schools and talk about it openly?" And I said, "It's a really difficult topic to talk about." And they said, "But we feel you deal with it sensitively." So my characters move on. And then I wrote Cut Flowers. And that's had an amazing response. Both books are PSHE accredited lesson plans. So I'm setting up the charity, I'm working with school children, and the whole time I'm thinking, what would my dad have said? What would his opinion be on what I'm doing? Because in 2002, I lost my father. He held a dream that he was going to build a college in our village in Himachal Pradesh, Jahu, a college for girls to be educated. There was a lot of early marriage, not forced marriage in our village, because girls couldn't get educated. The parents weren't happy for them to be sent away to have an education. It was too risky, too dangerous, and it just wasn't done. And my dad had a dream that he would build a college up in the village for girls. And he was going to concentrate on teacher training. So he raised the money and he fulfilled his dream. He built an amazing college up in our village and 100 students enrolled that we covered the fees for. And unfortunately, after the first term, we lost my dad and he was at his college there. And I managed to go back to India and perform the last rites, and he had a full Hindu cremation, which means opening up his skull, which is something I did. Over 5,000 people attended his funeral because he was a very inspirational man that made a difference to many people's lives. And he still makes a difference because through his dreams of what he has taught me, I've been able to go on and help other people. And now what we're working on is a campaign to demand, not to ask, but to demand virginity testing is made a criminal offence in this country. Can you imagine, as a young woman, a young girl, your parents suddenly tell you that you're going to be forced to have a virginity test to prove that you are pure? What right has anybody got to do that to a young girl, to a woman in this country today? This is openly advertised in Harley Street clinics that are charging hundreds of pounds. And then girls who are not virgins or their hymen isn't intact have so-called hymen replacement that can cost up to £3,000. I had a call in at our help centre where a young girl said to us, "Can you help me fund this operation?" And I said, "We don't have any money. As a charity, we're struggling. Freedom needs rescuing itself so we can save more girls and boys." And she said, "Well, if I can't get the funding from you, I'll have to be a prostitute." Can you imagine a young woman having to do that? So on her wedding night, she can prove there's some blood on the sheets. And that's allowed to happen in this country today. We're not asking, we're demanding for this to be a criminal offence. There doesn't need to be any more consultation. When we go into schools and talk to children, it's really important to us that we talk to the young boys and men in the audience. Many people try to exclude 50% of the population, but for me, I believe very passionately that young men are part of the solution. They're going to be the generation that are going to make a difference. And when I go into schools, I get every young man to stand up and say very loudly, "Not in my name." Do not force a girl to get married in my name. Do not force a girl to be cut in my name. Do not force a girl to have a virginity test in my name. And all the boys in every school we have been in, and that's over 150, have stood up and said that. Young men want to be part of the solution, but the average age of a perpetrator of a forced marriage isn't granny or granddad or an uncle overseas. It's a 22-year-old man that's been educated in the UK. We have to work through education to educate young boys about what their responsibilities are. When I was writing But It's Not Fair, we were looking at where we could get the book published and printed, and we were contacted by Doncaster Prison that had a prison printing press. And we were doing the launch at the Bank of England. And we went along, and my partner Tony came with me, and we were there at the prison meeting the prisoners. And on this particular day of the visit, a young prisoner came up to me and said, "I didn't really like your book." And I said, "Oh, what didn't you like about it? It's still possible for you to change things." He said, "No, I didn't like it because you wrote about what happened to my sister. I'm in prison. I'm married to a young woman who came over and married me. I've got girlfriends, and she didn't know about any of this, and I'm in here for robbery. But my sister was sent to Bangladesh and was forced to marry. And I haven't thought about her for years. I hadn't thought of the fact she was just taken aboard, got married, and that was the end of it. But you've made me think about what's happening in my own family and what I'm doing." So he said, "That's why I didn't like your book, because it's keeping me awake at night." Unfortunately, we couldn't get any more books printed at Doncaster Prison because they weren't allowed to use strong glue to stitch the pages together. So we've had them done elsewhere. So I've set the charity up. We're working really hard. I've got a house in the country. I'm commuting back to London as I'm a magistrate. But I'm in excruciating pain the whole time. I'm ending up with pain on both sides of my face. And I go to the doctors, have hospital appointments, and I think I must be making up this pain because I'm really stressed and I'm working 18, 20 hours a day, and I'm putting my poor mother into financial difficulty as we keep giving things away because we run a charity that hasn't got any money. And I remember going to a dentist and having a wisdom tooth taken out, and the pain was still there, and this goes on for 7 years. And then I end up in a London hospital, University College London, and I have a specialist MRI, and they say, "Oh, you've got a condition called trigeminal neuralgia." Well, I couldn't pronounce it for about 1.5 years. And in the face, you have a trigeminal nerve. It's basically 3 nerves that come down. And my blood vessels are resting on this, and it causes excruciating pain. It's called the suicide pain. It's the most painful thing a human being can have, and I have it bilaterally. And when I discovered I had this, they said there's no cure, but all you can take is mind-altering drugs. Drugs for antidepressants. Well, I'm not depressed, I'm in pain. Yeah, sometimes I'm a bit upset about it, but I wouldn't need antidepressants. I want you to cure this. And there wasn't anything. Can I tell you, I can be given a repeat prescription of oral morphine, but I can't be given drugs that may actually release the pain because there isn't anything out there. So just before lockdown, I have surgery. It's called MVD surgery. And they went into the back of my head. They looked a really long time to see if there was a brain there. It was pea-sized, so they carried on working. And they managed to free my nerves off, but unfortunately it hasn't worked. But as a result of that piece of that surgery, I've now become the CEO of the TNA Association. And the reason for me raising this tonight is that even if you have pain in your life, even if you have to overcome things, you can make a difference regardless of where you are, regardless of what you do, you can make a difference. So tonight I'm not in pain because the adrenaline's kicked in. But afterwards, no doubt, I will have several attacks. But for us, I need to raise awareness of this condition because a lot of people take their own life because they're in pain, because no one can help them, no one hears them silently screaming. Because for many people, their partners, their families have left them because they suffer from this pain, and most people don't know what it is. So we need to raise awareness. Some people I've spoken to are taking marijuana to help with the pain. I've never tried it, I don't know if it would work. But people that have tried it have said it makes a difference. So we need to find a way that this can be declassified so people from TN can try it, rather than going to a backstreet dealer or someone turning up in a car and buying these drugs and they don't know what they're taking, or having to buy a private prescription for £300-400 a month. They can't afford to do that. We need to think about what laws are there in this country and who are they benefiting. So I've given you a whole variety of things that I'm doing, but I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Can you make a difference to help freedom? Can you rescue freedom from adversity? Because right now we need your help. We need your help so we can continue saving young girls and young boys from forced marriage, FGM, dishonour, violence. I am honoured to be here. I'm honoured to have the platform to speak to you this evening. And I know all of you will go on to do great things. But one of the greatest things that all of you can do is to save a life. So I hope today has inspired you to make a difference, to do something positive for someone else. And if you hear about someone that says, my family are forcing me into a marriage, take them seriously. You must believe them, because you could be the last person they speak to before they're taken on the plane, forced into marriage, and we can't always rescue every girl. We don't know where they are. And when we do rescue them, we bring them back to the UK. There's no space in the refuge. You have to change their identity. We have nowhere for these young girls to go to. And many of them end up going back home, back with the perpetrators that will then force them to marriage. Be the generation that makes a difference. Be brave. Thank you.
Anita, thank you so much for joining us. And as you will all see, Anita's been kind enough to donate books to the Oxford Union to all of the people in the audience today, and we'll have more copies in the library for those of you on the live stream. Perhaps you could start about telling us more about your inspiration for writing both of your books, but specifically for writing Cut Flowers.
So Cut Flowers, originally I was very hesitant to write a book about FGM. And I knew But It's Not Fair had been really widely received and really liked by these children that read it, but it's not only children, adults read it, all frontline professionals get copies too. So when I was asked to write about it, I said, okay. Then I started to talk to people. I ended up interviewing over 100 women that had gone through female genital mutilation. And I remember on one particular occasion speaking to a lady who had shared her story with me. And it just reminds me of the launch of Cut Flowers. So I'm in the Palace of Westminster, and Miriam Margolyes is there, who did the foreword for the book, and she's an amazing woman. I don't know if you've had her, but she's absolutely amazing. And we were launching the book, and I asked this lady to come along who had inspired one of my stories. And I'm going to share that with you. It does come with a health warning, but I don't apologise for that, because 200 million women and girls worldwide have gone through FGM. 5,000 girls a year in this country go through FGM. So I'm not going to apologise if this upsets you. So just go back to when you're 5 years old and that birthday party that you had. Are you excited about that party? Was it a wonderful experience? I know I was. I remember my 5th birthday party. It was wonderful. And Elizabeth, we'll call her Lizzie. Lizzie was no different to any other 5-year-old. She had her hair braided and she was excited about it, but all the way through, she'd been promised her own prayer mat, and she was choosing the colours of her prayer mat. So every other day she would go up to the lady making the mat and look at how her mat was developing, and she was so excited about it. And Lizzie was on stage with me, and I was holding her hand because she was very scared about sharing her story. And it was the first time she had shared it, and she hadn't even shared it with her husband. And so she said to me, so I was excited about my birthday party, and on that particular day of her party, about 30 girls turned up, and boys and their families, and there was singing and dancing and the most wonderful food. And she was having a fantastic time. And then towards the end of it, her mother said, come on, we're all going off for a walk. And all the girls went singing and dancing into the woods. And in the distance, there was a hut. And Lizzie was the smallest of all the girls. So she was at the very back and she was very cross. She thought, they're going in the hut and they're going to choose my mat, my prayer mat. How is that going to happen? And she was taken in to the hut, and while she was there, it was finally her turn, and she's lifted up and the excitement grew that suddenly she was going to get this amazing present. And then she was blindfolded. That made it even more exciting. And then she was gagged. And then she was lifted into the hut, blindfolded and gagged at 5 years old, and it was silent. And she didn't understand what was going on. And then her underwear was removed. And she knew that was a bad thing. Her mother said, if anyone touches your underwear, it's a bad thing. So she was terrified. But she couldn't scream because she had this gag in her mouth. And then she said she experienced the worst pain she ever had between her legs. And she felt wetness as she was bleeding. But the pain didn't stop, as there were very sharp rose thorns inserted into her vagina to sew her up after she had been cut and mutilated. And all she wanted was her mother to save her. The gag was removed and she screamed, "Mum," for help. And as the blindfold removing, it was her mother standing there with a razor. Her mother had mutilated her. And she shared this story with me and with everybody else at the book launch. And then she looked at her husband and she said, "Do you remember what you were given as a wedding present by your mother?" And the poor man nearly fainted. And he nodded, said, "You were given a knife to cut me open." This isn't a story of something that happens in far-off countries. FGM is happening in the UK. That's why running a charity like Freedom, it's important we talk about it. We talk about things that nobody wants to speak about. Giving books to children in schools, talking to frontline professionals is the only way we will prevent it. We can prevent this in a generation. We can make young men the heroes that say, "I will not marry a girl that's been cut." I don't want this to happen. I don't want this to happen. None of us want this to happen. And you know what? These parents that do this aren't parents you'd find on child protection registers. They do it out of, they say, love, superstition, tradition. But we need to educate. I've been to a school, we were talking about the myths of FGM, and I remember a young girl was really angry. I remember looking at her face in the audience, and at the end she said to me, "You lied." I said, "What have I lied about?" She said, "You said the clitoris wasn't evil. It's really evil and it must be removed." She's a schoolgirl in school in Cambridge, and she truly believed that. She believed that because she had been cut, and that's what her family had told her. So we have to do something about it. We have to go to schools, colleges, universities, and talk about it openly, because without talking about it, we're not going to prevent it.
And your books have already made an incredible difference. How did you go about trying to put these stories into a book that you could give to young children to educate them?
I think it's really important when you talk to children, you don't dumb anything down, but you use age-appropriate language. But it's not fair. People that know me will probably recognise the Sophie character, that's a bit of a brat, is based on me and my childhood in East London. But it's just based on real stories and just trying to add some humour, even though there's dreadful things we're talking about. But making sure it's accessible, making sure that when you read it through, yes, you're going to be upset, but there's some happy things that happen too in the book. So read the book and see what happens. It's not all bad, but the book has saved lives. The books have saved lives, and that's really important.
And you founded Freedom Charity. Since then, you've created the first ever charity help app, which has had more than 250,000 downloads, and the first 24/7 phone line. Could you tell us a bit more about the work that Freedom Charity is doing now?
Freedom Charity is working really hard, and our main area of work is in education. is preventing crimes from happening. And by talking to young children really early, we can stop the crimes happening because they will know what to do. So if their parents say, look, you know, we're going to introduce you to someone, you're going to get married even if you don't want to, this is what's going to happen. They're told that they can speak to the safeguarding officer at school. They can pick up the phone and phone Freedom. They can use a help app and 2 clicks away from speaking to police or speaking to us. So it's really important that young people know that they have options. And our key message is around ending dishonoured violence in a generation. And that's why I think language is so important, that we use the right terminology. When we're talking about forced marriage, we need to use the term serial rape. We need to use the term child abuse. And FGM, let's say it's child abuse. Let's not worry about offending anybody. We need to save young girls. You know, Freedom Charity, when we go into schools, we're talking a lot to young boys that are forced to get married because they're gay. We're getting more girls contacting us and young men who are transgendering and their family are forcing them into marriage. So for us, making sure that the generation in schools now will be the generation it never happens to, the generation that will stop it from happening because they know they have choices. And I suppose for us that's the most important thing, that, you know, we can all make a difference.
And you were a leader from the beginning. You set up a United Assemblies in your school to unite students, and you spoke about your time with karate. What advice would you give to the young people in the audience today about making a difference in their own communities?
I think when we talk about making a difference, it doesn't have to be anything huge, but it's being passionate, believing in what you do and what you say. So if you see an injustice, if you look the other way, you're party to that injustice. If you see someone use hate language, do you step aside and just ignore it and say, this isn't my problem? Or do you go up to that person and challenge them? And I think that's the start of where you come from. I mean, when I set up United Assemblies, I remember at school and when I was doing my sixth form, you had a Christian assembly and a Jewish assembly. And I remember speaking to the head teacher and I said, well, I'm a Hindu. What assembly do I go to? And he said, well, you're not allowed to go to the Jewish assembly, so you need to go to the Christian assembly. And I remember coming home and speaking to my father about it. And he said, well, God is in everything and everyone. So go to the assembly, learn, digest. And I said, yes, but it's not fair. I want to learn about world religions. So I ended up speaking to the headmaster, who threatened to give me the cane. Actually, I now realise he wasn't allowed to do that, but at the time I didn't know that wasn't true. And he said, well, you can have you can set these assemblies up, but you need to bring all your students in for the announcements. So it started off with about 30 of us going to the separate room. We did an assembly and came back in, and all the school would look round at all these children of faces of colour walking back in. And that caused a bit of a stir, and some of the students were a bit intimidated about doing it. And then I started to invite world leaders, the top people that I could get hold of. I used to write lots of letters. It was pre-sending emails, and we managed to get the most amazing speakers ever to the school assembly. And instead of a trickle of about 20 or 30 children coming in at the end, you'd end up with half the school. And then they relinquished and said, actually, you're allowed to read the announcements out in the assembly. So it worked really well, and it really made me determined that we needed to talk about all the different issues and we couldn't be confined. And if the school were doing an injustice by saying we couldn't do this, we fought against it. So I think it's very important to fight for what you believe in.
Is that what was behind your decision to become a magistrate?
I was invited to become a magistrate, and I thought you needed a law degree, which you don't. And I was really encouraged by my mum and dad to do that. And I could see that the disparity in terms of crime. So, for example, we all know the fact that more black men are in prison than attend university. And more, you know, you're 8 times more likely to be stopped in London if you're black or Asian youth. And I wanted to understand why that happened. And you can't really challenge that from the outside. So when I applied and astonishingly I was appointed, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make sure that when people came to court, that they were treated fairly and with justice. And I truly believe that's what happens when they're in court with me. You know, I remember on my first day at sitting, someone said to me, there's 3 types of people. They're either bad. Okay, yeah, some people are bad. Some of them are sad. A lot of people are very sad. That's why crimes have happened, and a very small proportion are mad. And there's some other categories as well. But I think when I approached it, but by the grace of God, it could be me that's in court, a member of my family, you know, my darling nephew Rishi. It could be any of us. So you need to treat that person, regardless of what they've done, with respect and understand what has caused them for this to happen and what can prevent it from happening in the future.
You spoke about your recent work to ban virginity testing. For people that aren't up to date, could you tell us how that campaign is going?
So I've just written to the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and demanded that virginity testing becomes a criminal offence in this country and so-called hymen replacement. Because if this is allowed to happen, then families will demand that their girls are subjected to this. So when we're talking about a virginity test, you're talking about a young girl that may be tricked to go into a clinic, and it could be a male doctor on his own that will try and insert 2 fingers into a woman's vagina or a young girl's vagina to prove that she's a virgin. Doesn't prove anything. Some of the girls we're talking to say the doctors are getting off on performing this technique, and they feel degraded, they feel humiliated, they feel sexually assaulted. And why should a girl have to prove her virginity to anybody to get married? And it seems to be part of a package, a deal that's going on. So we've written to the Home Secretary, and we're now starting to talk to ministers and to as many people as we can. We want the media to get involved and join the campaign, because that's often what helps bring laws in place. And I'm pretty confident that this will become a criminal offence very soon, you know, hopefully within a year, because I know that some families will still force their daughters to go to backstreet clinics or may end up in someone's house and someone may do this test. But if it's a crime, at least that person can be brought to court, and it could save someone from the humiliation, the sexual assault, in my opinion, of having to undergo that.
Well, I'm keen to leave time for audience questions, but for those in the audience who've been inspired by what you've done so far, what can we do to help?
I think one of the things that we look at Freedom Charity is, are you a campaigner? Could you become an ambassador for Freedom Charity? Could you start talking about our work? Do you have a rich mum and dad that might want to help donate to the charity? You know, there's lots of things that you could do. But I think come to the website. It needs updating. We need to update the app. There's all kinds of work that we would love to do if the funding was there. I mean, you know, if I could say one wish at the moment that we could have is to have a specialist refuge for girls that are forced into marriage or going through FGM or any kind of dishonour. Not somewhere somewhere beautiful, somewhere they can be educated, somewhere they can learn new skills, somewhere we could train and bring professionals into. So they don't have to, when they're rescued, then have to find themselves living in a tiny accommodation where they can't cope and their items are being stolen and they're terrified of the neighbours next door. We want somewhere that can help educate them, where they could learn how to manage a bank account, how to find a job, get back into education, because that's what most of the girls we rescue want to do. They want to carry on and finish their education. And I think that would be my wish, that we could have a refuge and see this ended in a lifetime. But I think I think all of us can make a difference. So if you hear about someone this is happening to, pick up the phone and either call the police, speak to Freedom, come to our website. You know, there's various things that you have more ability probably than I have of saying what could be done. So use your imagination. Doing nothing isn't an option. We all have to make a difference in life.
Thank you. And any questions from the audience? Lady at the back, we'll bring you a microphone. If you could stand up, say your name, and you can remove your mask as well.
Hi, I'm Anna. So this is, I don't know how to word this question, but you said if you see, you know, an injustice happening, whether it be human rights or animal rights or anything like that, how do you start to get the conversation going without, you know, perhaps being accused of something that you might not know the culture or, you know, anything like that? Just how to start talking about those things that you might see as an injustice?
I think if it feels wrong, when you hear about something and it feels wrong, do some research. You know, Google's an amazing tool. Start asking people. And I think once you know something is wrong, any type of abuse is wrong, you know. So we have to stand up against that, be it against children, be it against animals, be it against the planet. We have to stand up and make a difference, because if we don't, who will? Are we waiting for somebody else to do that on our behalf? We have to, you know, I have to look at myself in the mirror at night, not always a pretty sight, and know I've done a good job that day and feel proud of where we are. And, you know, when I go home and talk to my mum and we talk about how the day's been, she always says to me, be brave. I'm really proud of what you're doing. And that drives me forward. And coming from a loving, supportive family where, you know, massive sacrifices have been made to allow me to have the platform to carry on has made a big difference. So I would say if you see something that's wrong, openly talk about it. Say it, you know, because if you don't, you're allowing that injustice to continue forever. And that's the only way we're going to make a difference. You know, when I first started talking about forced marriage, I was a lone voice out there. I remember speaking to lots of government ministers and they said, this is not going to happen. We're not going to make this a crime. You're going to drive it underground. You're going to offend so many communities. Offend? You're talking about child abuse. You're talking about serial rape. You're talking about girls more likely to commit suicide. I'm not worrying about offending perpetrators. We need to save lives. We need to make a difference. We need to give women and girls their rights back. We demand this. We're not asking, we're taking those rights back.
How do you choose which campaign? We've covered a lot of ground this evening. You've spoken about medical marijuana, you've spoken about FGM, of course, forced marriages. How do you choose which issue you're going to address next?
I think they just come to us. I think it's the people that pick up the phone and call the helpline, people that email me, people that stop me in the streets. I remember I was walking in Stratford in East London. I'd just come out of court and a young woman was doing these curly things with your hair and she kept calling me over and I said, it's okay, I haven't got time to have my hair done. And she kept insisting. So I went over and she just passed me a note and it had a phone number on it. So I thought, well, I don't think she's asking me out on a date, so I'll give her a ring. And I rang her up, and I texted her and I said, hi, my name's Anita, you stopped me in the mail. Is there anything I can do? And then a day later, she contacted me and she told me she was being held as a slave. She was being forced to work, doing this hair twirling thing. And she said she'd been brought over from Eastern Europe and she was told she was going to become a teacher in the UK. And her parents had sold everything for her to come over, to pay for her ticket. She'd come over illegally. And she was in a room with several girls and she had to pay for her flight, even though her parents had paid for it. And she'd run up this huge bill. And they said every day the accommodation was costing £100 despite sharing a room with several girls. So instead of working in a school, which she'd been promised a job as, she was doing various jobs. And this was one of the jobs. And I said to her, look, we can get you out of here. You know, I'll call the police, we'll do a sting operation, I've got lots of contacts, we'll get you out. And she just said, you can't because I know where my family live and my family will be at risk. And I remember we went to Camden Town, I went with my nephew, and she was being forced to sell these zip pencil cases. I don't know if you've seen them, but I didn't want one. They're really expensive, they're like £15. And so Rishi said to me, come on, you've got to buy some of these so this girl doesn't get in trouble. And I really wanted to get her out of that situation. because she was held as a modern-day slave and she couldn't leave. So that's how you find campaigns that you fight against. You know, and we look at slavery where young people are forced to traffic drugs, you know, county lines, you know. There's so many cases out there. So there's so many cases that I want to help and deal with and make a difference in. So I suppose it's when people contact the charity, people contact me personally. And, you know, I have a saying that, you know, if you contact Freedom, we're going to believe you. You know, we dealt with a very high-profile slavery case, and I remember saying this on national TV, and then I end up, you know, someone phoning up and saying, "I've got an alien on my roof. You said you're going to believe me. What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to call up a TV camera crew and see if they'll come down and film this alien." You know, but we can't stand by. We have to do something, and I'm really passionate about that.
And there's a question at the front of the Otto Barrow first, and then we'll move to Theo.
Thank you for an excellent and really awe-inspiring speech. One thing you've mentioned several times during your talk is about all of these sort of you've hinted at some of the sort of barriers to actually getting the sort of changes that you sort of see as necessary to happen into the legislation and sort of into people's minds. What do you think the biggest institutional sort of constraints that we sort of currently face as a society to actually get some of these changes put into the law?
I think a lot of this is people believing it's not an issue that affects them. So when Freedom ran a campaign against forced marriage, we deliberately chose a girl that was white with blonde hair and blue eyes as our campaign girl against forced marriage. And that caused a huge amount of controversy. I can't tell you how much hate mail I got because of that. But it was saying forced marriage can happen in any community. And so it's challenging stereotypes and not worrying about offending a community that is perpetrating violence. You can't worry about being sensitive around that. You just have to say, if you're doing something that's wrong, if you're committing child abuse, we have to bring it out. And I think because we've been so scared of being called a racist or whatever other terminology people want to use against us, we've not challenged this. I remember speaking to Theresa May and said, you know, if we were talking about white middle-class girls that were being forced into a marriage, in the same numbers we're talking about girls from 90 countries that are forced into marriage, this would already be a criminal offence. But she was very proactive in help make this a criminal offence. You know, she was very proactive. And so if it's wrong, it's wrong. It doesn't matter what community it's from. We have to just stand up and say, this has to stop. And these young girls in particular don't have a voice. They're hidden, especially when they're taken out of school so young. So if we don't say it, who's going to?
And the Senior Access Officer, Theo.
Hi, yeah. So thank you so much. I think this has been the best talk of the whole term. So I just wanted to say thank you personally.
Oh, wow, thank you.
It's been amazing. So you've had a massive learn up this time. My question for you, if that's okay, is you mentioned you're from Ends in Bethnal Green and you shared a bed with your sister. And so you've come from a beginning showing that barriers have never stopped you. But have you seen so much oblivious to people rising up the ranks? Have you felt that was a hard journey? And how have you found it now reaching into owning your own charity and being around rich people who different backgrounds to you?
Really interesting question, thank you. I didn't know we were poor, actually. I didn't know that we didn't have very much. I remember not wanting to ask for birthday presents and Christmas presents because my parents would go without. So they might go without some meals, you know, if we asked for lots of things. So I wasn't really aware of that until we moved to Chigwell, and then suddenly it became very obvious that we were very different from other people. But I think one of the things it taught me at 17 when I had to stop education to help pay the mortgage, because I remember my dad after having a heart attack, and he was sacked from his job because he had a heart attack and a bypass. You know, I can't even imagine saying that, how awful that is. And we had lots of bills that had come in and they were sitting on the side, and my dad was sitting there and he was opening them and he was in tears saying, I just don't know how we're going to cover these. And my sister was already at university, and I just said to him, well, don't look at them. He said, what do you mean, don't look at the bills? And I said, from this moment onward, we just never talk about it. He said, what are you talking about? I said, look, and I took the bills and I said, that's it. You don't look at them, we don't talk about them again, I'll just cover it. So I was my mum's Saturday girl in her shop in London when I was 11. She had a children's clothes shop. And then started teaching karate. I had 7 clubs. They were really successful. And then my father was saying, you know, you can't charge people for talent and the skill that you have. So students that can't afford to pay shouldn't pay. So they ended up having free lessons that everyone couldn't afford to pay, of course. But I think for me, I mean, actually, it's a fantastic charity. Freedom's amazing, but needs rescuing because, as I say, we don't have any money at the moment. But for me, it's not been about that. I think if you visualise or if you really want something to happen that's good, it will happen. So make it happen for you, you know. Don't think about all the negatives in your way. If I want something to happen, I don't think, oh, what's the scale I need to go up? I'll just write straight to the Prime Minister. I mean, you know, one of the people I'm desperate to contact is Oprah Winfrey, because I want to be on her book list, because I know it will make her book a bestseller and it will help the charity because all the profits go from that. And when we were sort of thinking about how the charity could raise money, it wasn't about thinking we need to go cap in hand to government and other organisations. Having a symbol, the triangle that we're both wearing today, is the national symbol against FGM. And if everyone was just to buy a badge, if that's the one thing you do, it means that we can give a book to a child. We can donate that just by buying a badge. It's not a big deal, is it? You know, and we've got a badge for each of you tonight, so you should wear that on the left-hand side. But I think if you want something, go for it. Don't be afraid to ask the top person you know or in your circle for help. I have to tell you, when I ring people, most people avoid my calls. And even being invited here tonight, I thought, well, it's a spoof. No one really wants me to speak at the Oxford Union, such a prestigious hall. But I think if you want something, just go for it. Go for whatever your dreams are and then go beyond some. You know, my dad used to say, the only thing that's stopping you is your imagination and hard work. But I've got a really big imagination and I work pretty hard too. So I think just go for whatever your dreams are and add some to it.
Anita, we're so glad that you did choose to join us today. It's been a real honour to have you. I'll finish with one question that we've been asking all of our speakers. If you could take everything you've learned and everything you've experienced and bottle it for one thing for our audience members to take away with them this evening, what would that be?
Oh, that's difficult. Cherish and love the people that are around you. Have respect and where you come from. Respect your mum and dad, they're not around forever. Try and laugh, try and love, but doing nothing isn't an option. If something is wrong, stand up. Stand up and make as much noise as you can. Because if a real life Cockney sitting here can do it, so can you. We can all make a difference. And we have a duty to do that. It's our responsibility to save lives.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our final debate. And please join me in thanking Anita Frem.